Welcome back to The Mind of Brandon. Today we're going to continue our Bible study. As indicated by the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about the myth of Cain and Abel. Now, Cain and Abel are the first sons of Adam and Eve, who I talked about in some detail in the video just prior to this one. Adam and Eve, of course, were the first man and the first woman created by the Lord God and placed in the Garden of Eden, promptly getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden for feasting upon the forbidden fruit of knowledge. So it's after that they have the sons Cain and Abel. Now, Abel is described as a keeper of sheep, and Cain is described as a tiller of the ground. And so when they bring offerings to their god Yahweh, translated into English as the Lord, the offerings that they bring are associated with their professions. So Cain brings fruit from the ground, and Abel brings the firstlings of his flock and their fat. Or in other words, Cain brings crops and Abel brings meat. Now, it's not entirely clear why this is, but the Lord favors the meat offering that is presented by Abel. I guess for many of you it might be easy just to say, well, yeah, I mean, I'd rather have meat than veggies. Nice, juicy steak, right? Personally, I'd just put them together and make a nice salad. You know, no reason to be like, well, I like this one better than that one. Right? That's just me personally. But the Lord definitely is favoring this meat offering over this offering of crops. And it's possible that he just prefers meat, but another possibility is that Cain just isn't a very good farmer, so the crops that he brings aren't any good. A third possibility that I think is our most likely scenario here is that Cain might actually be a pretty decent farmer, but he's not being very selective about which crops he brings. Notice that Abel brings the firstlings of his flock. Makes it sound like maybe he's being selective about the quality of the meat that he brings. Cain's probably just pulling whatever out of the ground, right? So that might be the situation there. That might be why the Lord favors this meat offering over Cain's offering of crops. That being said, the fact that we're seeing the acceptable use of animals for their meat, or even the favorable use of animals for their meat here, that's a little out of character with what we've seen so far in the Bible. Remember that in my previous videos I talked about two different stories that come prior to this one. There was a cosmocentric creation account focused on the origins of the universe that took up all of Genesis chapter 1 and the first 3.5 verses of Genesis chapter 2, keeping in mind that those chapter and verse divisions were not added to the Bible until the 13th century of the Christian era. The second story I talked about was the anthropocentric creation account focused on the origins of man. That took up the rest of Genesis chapter 2 and all of Genesis chapter 3. That was the story with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the talking snake, and those mystical trees that grow magical fruits. Anyway, so both those stories, in my opinion, despite their inconsistencies that demonstrate they're two different stories written by two different authors coming from two different subcultures, despite those inconsistencies, there is a consistency among them. That is, they both appear to have been written by vegetarians. In the first story, God tells man and the animals to eat the vegetation. It doesn't say anything about eating animals, just eat the vegetation. Actually, the way it's phrased in my King James Version of the Bible is that vegetation is to be used for meat. The way I interpret that is, instead of eating meat, eat the vegetation. In the second story, the Lord God tells man to eat the fruit from any of the trees in the Garden of Eden, except, of course, from the fruit of knowledge, the tree of knowledge. Again, it doesn't tell him to eat any of the animals. In fact, the reason the animals are created in that story is to provide man with companions. The Lord God creates animals because it's not right for man to be alone. So both these stories really do look to me like they're written by vegetarians. And then all of a sudden we come to this story about Cain and Abel, and not only is the meat offering the acceptable offering, it's the favored one, right? So that's a little out of character. And it really brings it home to us that once again we have another story coming from a different author who comes from a different subculture. This is, of course, reflected in the designations used for the Creator God. Remember, in the first story, he's called simply God, at least in English. In Hebrew, he's called Elohim. In the second story, he's called the Lord God, or in Hebrew, Yahweh Elohim. Here in the third story, he's called simply the Lord, or Yahweh. So, Abel is favored by the Lord. This upsets Cain. He's perhaps a little bit jealous. So the Lord lectures him on karmic justice. He tells him something along the lines of, do good things and good things will happen to you. Do bad things and bad things will happen to you. That's more or less what he tells him. And so in the next scene, it talks about how Cain and Abel were out in the field one day talking to each other, and then Cain killed his brother Abel. Yeah, we don't get a lot of detail leading up to it. It's just, you know, they're out in the field talking, and then Cain killed his brother. It doesn't even tell us how Cain went about killing his brother Abel. We don't know if he beat him to death with his fists, or broke his neck, or bludgeoned his skull in with a rock, stabbed him, or slashed his throat. Maybe he smothered him, or strangled him, or shoved him off a cliff, or shot him with a bow and arrow, right? He might have poisoned him, or drowned him, or decapitated him. He could have lynched him from a tree. He could have lured him into a cave with a hungry bear, or lured him into a house and then burned it down. He might have even just trampled over him with a horse. We don't know. The precise method that Cain used to kill his brother Abel is left to the imagination. So the Lord comes to Cain and he asks him, Cain, where is your brother Abel? Cain's response is a little snarky. He says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? This is the point when the Lord starts freaking out. He says, what have you done? The blood of your brother cries out to me from the ground. He figures out that Cain has slain his brother Abel. He's a murderer. And so, Cain is going to be banished from the earth. That's what it says in my King James Version of the Bible. He's banished from the earth. Now, don't think that that means he leaves the planet. I believe that earth here is being used synonymously with the land, because he's really just being relocated from whatever this land is to some other land which is east of Eden. It's a land called Nod. The Lord also puts a mark on Cain. This is to show people that he's a murderer, okay? And Cain's basically freaking out about this. He's worried that people are going to see this mark on him, and they're going to kill him. Now this is interesting, because if you think about it, right? Prior to this point, how many people have actually been created? Well, let's see. You have Adam and Eve, right? They were created. And then they gave birth to the sons Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. So who's there to kill Cain? Who are these people that might come across Cain, see this mark on him, and then decide to kill him? There's no previous mention of them. It's possible, that you say, well, maybe he's talking about his parents. He might come across Adam and Eve, and they might kill him, right? If that were the case, I think the way it would be phrased here is, my parents are gonna kill me, right? But it doesn't do that. You get the impression, really, he's afraid of running into strangers, and that those strangers are going to kill him. So it's almost like the author just kind of forgot that the only people we have so far are Adam, Eve, and Cain, because Abel's dead. All right. In fact, after Cain sent away, we're going to hear about him having a wife, just appears out of nowhere. Right? So he has a wife, and then he has a kid with this wife. And then he builds a city that he names after his kid. What use does a man, his wife, and their kid have for an entire city? Typically, a city comes with a bunch of different people, right? Again, where do these people come from? It doesn't say. So, yeah, it's like the author just kind of forgot, oh, yeah, we have, just Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, and then Cain kills Abel. So really it should just be Adam, Eve, and Cain. But no, all of a sudden there's all these other people just out of nowhere. No explanation as to where they came from. So, in other words, this story has some interesting holes in it, right? Just some missing information. It's possible that what's going on here is that several different versions of the story have basically been combined together. And so, maybe there's a version that actually accounts for where all these other people came from. But a lot of people are just content to figure, oh, well, this woman that is Cain's wife, that's his sister. She's a daughter of Adam and Eve, and it just doesn't mention her for whatever reason. Okay. Or in other words, basically, we're left in a situation where all we can do is make up possible explanations for where all these other people came from. That being said, it does go on to describe how, there would be future generations that would be descended from Cain. It also mentions that Adam and Eve went on to have another son called Seth. Okay? Now, Seth, right, he comes after Cain and Abel, so he's not responsible for any of these other people that Cain is worried about, any of the people that would live in Cain's city. I guess the best I can figure is he builds a city for his future generations, but, again, that's just making up explanations. We don't know. Interesting, the Seth character, because there's another story of fratricide from ancient Egypt where one of the characters is called Seth. In this story, Seth actually is the one who kills his brother, a guy called Osiris. Osiris is favored by the gods as the king of Egypt. Seth covets the throne. He wants to be king, so he kills his brother Osiris. Right? By the way, in Roman tradition, we have a city builder called Romulus, and he has a brother called Remus. Romulus builds a city. He puts a wall up around it. Remus looks at these walls. He's basically laughing at them. He wants to show Romulus why he's laughing at them, so he jumps over the wall. Just kind of showing him, it's so pointless you have these walls up here. I can just hop right over it. Romulus gets pissed off, and he kills his brother Remus, just as the city builder Cain killed his brother Abel. That being said, there's a Sumerian story about a dispute between two brothers. It's not a story of fratricide, doesn't end with either of them killed, but it does have some interesting similarities to this Cain and Abel story. Just as the Cain and Abel story begins by establishing, well, here's the professions of Cain and Abel, here's the offerings that they bring to the Lord. This is how our Sumerian story is going to be, and this is the story of Emesh and Enten, or summer and winter. So, it establishes their professions and the offerings that they bring to the Lord. In this case, the Lord is the Lord of the Wind, Lord Lil, or Enlil in Sumerian. And so, in this story, Winter sees the offerings that Summer brings. He gets jealous, starts a quarrel with his brother, and then Summer winds up challenging his position as farmer of the gods. And so they get into a dispute, and they wind up bringing this dispute before Enlil. He winds up explaining, well, here's why Winter is favored as farmer of the gods. So, this is about where the similarity between this story and the Cain and Abel story comes to an end. But all you really have to do to make it even more like the Cain and Abel story is have one of these brothers kill the other one. Right? And my point here is, really this Cain and Abel story does kind of look like a conglomeration of different stories, or at least traits from different stories. And that, if you recall from my video just prior to this one, that's going to be a reoccurring theme in these early biblical texts. A lot of these stories really look like they're just conglomerations of different stories that have been handed down through tradition, altered a bit. Don't get me wrong, just because two stories are similar, have similarities, that doesn't mean that one of them necessarily influenced the other. But one of the things we are going to be talking about in my future videos is which cultures are known historically to have been influential on one another. So that being said, to be continued, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, maybe even share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. In my next video, I'm going to be returning to the book of Genesis to discuss flood myths. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you for watching. Peace, and have a good one.